In this series, I'm talking about my favorite designers. These are the people whose work have really inspired me. Now, what's unusual about the designer I'm going to talk about today is that I actually don't think he's ever designed a single piece that I thought was remarkably beautiful or really clever. I really admire him because of his career more than any individual piece. And I don't think there's any other designer whose career path has inspired me directly to make decisions about my business as a designer the way that I have. So I'm talking about the Italian designer Enzo Mari. Now, I first heard about him when I was in undergrad. And I was talking to one of my professors, and I was sort of saying, like, wait, are all the famous designers, did they all get associated with like major brands or have sort of wealthy people patronizing their work that got them to do these magnificent projects that then sort of captured the world's attention? And he's like, oh, you should check out Enzo Mari. So I looked at it and I was like, wait, what? How is this guy famous? Because his work is just so basic DIY-ish. And what was interesting is that he was sort of a communist kind of sympathizer, and his work is sort of seen as like a manifesto against Western sort of capitalism. Now, I don't share any of his political views. I actually have very dissimilar ones. But I still thought what was really interesting is that how he could carve out this remarkable career where he was put into the history of design without ever doing anything that was like hard or exceptional or involved exotic new technology or techniques. Everything he makes looks pretty basic. So I dug a little deeper into him and I found some of his early drawings and stuff like that. And what intrigued me was that he figured out what I would later try to do. He figured out how to design for people that couldn't afford to hire him to be a designer. Enzo Mari's work is not about creating this super polished thing that becomes highly coveted and prized that then increases in value and you try to limit the supply and really build a brand around it. He's not one of those designers that tried to make his work into high-end art. He's also not a designer that tried to like mass produce his stuff and then make it as cheap as possible through sort of factory and industrialized production, which was the kind of dominant movement in design during his time period, sort of in that kind of modernist age. He, for sort of, what seems to be political reasons, kind of took this very counter-culture, very critical approach to what was going on culturally. And I think we can all kind of, regardless of our politics, kind of like see a certain critique, right? I mean, I kind of see that with a lot of like the sports cars. Inexpensive cars like Toyota Corollas or a Honda or like a Ford Focus have never been better. Like entry-level cars are like pretty fast, corner well, safe compared to what they used to be when I was a kid. But they still keep making more and more expensive supercars and all these things. And you kind of look at it, it's like, well, do I really need a McLaren or a Bugatti? No matter the color, really? I guess it appeals to somebody. I'm personally very happy with a Toyota Tacoma out here in the desert. Maybe eventually I'll upgrade to something electric, but for now it's pretty good. But so I think I can relate to some critiques of the excesses that people go to when it comes to design, where they start making things gold-plated. And even with things like food, I kind of feel like there's points of diminishing returns. I had like a friend invite me to say, hey, you want to fly out to Copenhagen? I can get us into Noma. And it's like this, supposed to be the best restaurant in the world. And I was like, okay, yeah, I appreciate craftsmanship at the highest level. But when it becomes this thing where you're spending money on plane tickets and flights just to have a meal, I guess that's cool. Maybe sometime I'll do it. By that time, it didn't really feel like worth rearranging schedule for. But at some level, right, craft or excessive design starts to feel superfluous or too extra. Now, where I draw that line and where anyone else draws the line is going to be different. But what I think is interesting about Enzo Mari's work is that he wasn't just interested in reaching the masses through factory means of production. He wanted to reach it directly with kind of like DIY-esque designs. And I don't think DIY was a term that he used, but when you read his writings, at least to how it was translated from Italian, it becomes very clear that he liked the idea that he thought people making their own tables and chairs and benches, even with crude tools and pretty simple design that are just very rational would at least make them appreciate some use case of it, or appreciate the simple necessities of life, or there would be some enjoyment or nobility being involved with the means of production. And I mean, I certainly hope that that's true. I hope that, some of my DIY projects I think are pretty efficient and can save people time or money, but not all of them. But the ones that I think are kind of on the edge, where it might actually just be cheaper to go to IKEA or less time or less trouble, I hope that the people that do build them are getting some additional satisfaction. Maybe it's through sort of customizing it. Maybe it's just knowing where the materials came from. But I do see there being some sort of intangible benefits in addition to just sort of form and function and cost. So what sort of intrigued me early on about him is that I saw a designer that was able to be deemed as important by my sort of professors, who I really respected and was open to their sort of opinions, that never kind of got like a big brand deal or like a line at Target or anything like that. He kind of sort of published his ideas, went direct to the people, and just showed people how to make things. And I guess, I don't think it's I think the earliest DIY book technically is sort of an engineering book from like the 1600s. Someone wrote kind of like a practical home engineering book or something like that. But this, I think, was like pretty close from it might be the first kind of furniture DIY book, and particularly one that was done by an award-winning designers whose work has been featured in major museums and shows. So as a young designer, I wanted to try to find my manifesto. What was important to me? What was going to be the sort of, what ideals would my work embody? Now, those could be very, egalitarian and want to be like for the masses. And I talked about that in my TED Talk, that I did want to try to find a way to make my ideas more accessible by publishing them on YouTube and, other sort of social media stuff. But just because there's a noble purpose doesn't mean there isn't selfish interest. And what intrigued me early on about him was that he was able to be notable while still having an intention that was really important to him, that he seemed to be mostly consistent with. Now, he is like one that you'll see later on, always wearing kind of like very nice suits and smoking expensive cigars. Really fabulous beard as an older gentleman. At the same time, he was sort of lamenting Western civilization. So nobody is a bastion of ideological purity. And if they are, you just haven't been looking closely enough. But those two things sort of intrigued me, that he was able to have this kind of like very kind of distributed, open source kind of approach to design, but it wasn't necessarily like suffering from having a notable career because of that. So that was like my initial sort of interest. Later on, the way that he sort of demonstrated how you could do a lot with a little became increasingly interesting. I should note, though, is the lesson also I take from him is how you shouldn't fall too in love with your own ideology, because your work eventually is going to speak for itself, and people aren't going to remember every part of your manifesto. They're going to get a very different idea about you. So even though he was this kind of like anti-capitalist designer, I'm just going to show people how to make simple tables and benches with the bare necessity of tools and simple lumber, and it shouldn't be fancy. It shouldn't be these things that give you a status symbol. They should just be honest materials made with practical design and engineering, so that you get the function and you know where it comes from. Well, just because he meant all of that, and just because that's what he preached, it doesn't mean there aren't reproductions of his very crude chairs selling for thousands of dollars now. So you may have your ideas and you may have your manifestos, but somebody else might take those and run with them. So his work is now sold in a way that's kind of the antithesis of what it was supposed to be. But that was also a lesson that I took from it, is like, take your motivation seriously, but don't take yourself and your work seriously. And I remember my first example of dealing with that is one of my first projects that I really saw a lot of people taking what I designed and then making it for themselves, was the bucket stool. The concrete bucket stool is probably my most made project. It's definitely not one of my top 10 most viewed projects, but it's definitely the one when I look on Instagram posts that I get tagged on. I've seen people all over the world make those sort of stools. So when I originally designed it, I called it the $5 bucket stool because you can make it at the time for less than $5. Like half a bag of concrete. The concrete bags were about $3.50 then, and some dowels. Real simple. So even though I intended it to be the super affordable, minimalistic DIY project, within about 6 months of me publishing the design, I saw people like selling them on Instagram and Etsy and stuff like that. Or maybe it was a little bit later than that. But it definitely didn't take too long for me to people selling them as kind of like a high-end kind of Etsy boutique design where they're selling them for a few $100s. Now, I thought that was awesome, right? Like, I kind of knew going in, I just want to share what I had figured out or experimented with, and then let other people take ownership with what they want to do with it. But it was a good lesson that just because I think of something as like, okay, here's the recipe that is affordable, accessible, almost anywhere in the world you could build this, don't need a lot of tools. And then someone makes like a really fancy one. They even did some like gold dipped or gold plated legs and stuff like that. And we're selling them as like high-end bar stools and stuff like that. I don't know if they're still doing it, but there's a few people doing that. So I did take from it that you can have aspirations and sort of ideology that intrigues you and motivates you and drives you. But don't expect the rest of the world to see you through that lens. Even now, like sometimes I'll do a project that's a little more esoteric or a little bit more on the installation art stand side of things. And people will be like, aren't you the DIY guy? Well, that's not a DIY project. What are you doing? Spiral staircase? No one's got CNCs. So in seeing how someone that was pretty pure or stayed pretty in line, at least with their published work, with this one agenda, but still how it could get misinterpreted, his career to me sort of taught me that like, oh, don't take it too seriously. Yeah, be driven by that, but be aware that people are going to adapt your work for whatever purposes they want. And yeah, I kind of think it's like when I kind of see, it reminds me of some times where I've seen Rage Against the Machine played at political rallies that are kind of very machine-like. And it's like, did you listen to the lyrics on that? But that's what happens. People produce culture with maybe a very narrow intent, but culture in society is kind of like, no, we just like this for this. But let's dive a little bit into the design work itself. So the first thing I saw was the table and one of his chairs. And when I looked at them, I was intrigued and puzzled. I was intrigued because I was like, wait, I could totally build that right now as like a second year designer. Like that's well within my woodworking capabilities. And woodworking was probably the fabrication type I was most comfortable with at the time. But at the same time, I was like, wait, that's not even good woodworking. And then I was intrigued because I was like, wait, this guy became famous enough to be in the library at my design school, but wasn't as good at woodworking as I was. And I was like, I know woodworkers, from my hometown that were way better than this guy, but none of them had done anything that would end up in a museum. So that started my sort of deep dive. And then I was like, oh, the accessibility is the key. And not just accessibility with just, a lot of his stuff can be made with a handsaw, hammer, and nails, but with like wood that's not even consistent dimensions. If you look at the table, those structural members don't have to be the same thicknesses. The way he builds structural integrity by making very crude trusses, they don't have to be the same widths. I mean, the boards at the tabletop, probably should be uniform in their thickness so you don't have a super wobbly table. And a level might be handy, but you don't need a lot of clamps, and you can kind of not even be that precise with your cuts. And I was like, wait, this is super forgiving. And so for all the crudeness and all the ugliness, the forgiveness is the overriding idea. Now, you may think like, well, great, does the world really need? I mean, we can mass produce designs pretty cheaply. IKEA, Target, they have tables that are way more refined, way more sophisticated, and super inexpensive. But it's not like if you decorated your home with that kind of furniture, people are going to be like, wow, this place is special. And what I do think is intriguing about this kind of crude but kind of charming woodworking is that you could take these chairs and this table, and if you had like a little brick patio with some overgrown weeds and some potted plants, some terracotta, and these were just all made out of reclaimed pallets, no thickness planer to perfectly plane the boards, just a little bit of sanding to get rid of the splinters, you could definitely make something that would feel pretty timeless. And when you think about what people like with sort of vintage design, people will go into like a European farmhouse, like in the countryside of Italy or the south of France or something, and everything will be kind of dilapidated and made with unsophisticated tools. The plaster's uneven, parts are chipping off, but everything's authentic. Everything's real. Nothing's a faux finish. And people love to share those photos of those kind of places on Instagram. I mean, even with like kind of like, people exploring abandoned buildings with all the decayed steel and concrete and, holes through the roof that let dramatic light shine through. There's almost a value in that kind of mediocrity from a fabrication standpoint, or even that sense of disarray, because it's more unusual than just another sort of big box kind of shiny places with stucco on the outside, fluorescent lights on the inside, and everything's clean and precise, but nothing's really authentic and one-off. Again, I think we also see that with food. I don't think the best meals I've ever had are the fanciest ones that were created with the most highly trained chefs. I mean, some of the most memorable food experiences I have had been like eating a really ripe tomato right out of a garden, or going salmon fishing in Oregon and cooking it over a campfire. We didn't like sous vide the salmon or put truffles on anything. It was like, but the closeness to the means of production makes the experience seem pretty remarkable, even if all the accoutrements are not. And it's hard to translate that one-off experience into mass production. That's where you tend to lose a little bit of the intangible enjoyment. So I think, and it's still funny that like to this day, that reproductions that are probably very carefully crafted to look amateurish are selling for a lot of money. Blows my mind, but that's just kind of the weird, perverse world that we live in. I also felt the same kind of sense of around sort of like vintage shirts or throwback jerseys for sports teams. I think when Urban Outfitters first started doing brand new vintage looking shirts, I was like, oh man, we kind of jumped the shark as a society, right? Before Urban Outfitters existed or companies like that, you kind of collected those kind of vintage rock shirts from thrift stores, and it was a real hard find. And then all of a sudden you could just get reproductions that were pre-weathered to look kind of that, like that threadbare 50-50 cotton poly blend that looks like it's been through the washing machine, 1,000 times, even though it's brand new. And so there's been a lot of that kind of like fake rustic kind of stuff. You see it a lot with like the modern farmhouse design, where people are taking coffee and spilling it onto wood and whitewashing and doing that. And I've certainly done finishes like that because it seemed like what people sort of wanted. But I think the most egregious to me was like purposeful recreations of vintage like sports jerseys, right? Where they're like, oh, we stopped producing this, but now we're going to produce it to get new versions but we're not going to like go find the old fabrics that were used for the ones from the 1960s. We're going to make them out of like contemporary synthetics. And I think that's where a little bit of the idea gets lost. But that's the inevitable nature of like the dominant sort of economic system that you're in. You can write your manifestos and try to rage against that machine all you want, but ultimately you're only as powerful as your reach and your brand and your ability to kind of give things to people directly. So when I look at his work, I think the first thing I took away from it, in addition to sort of directly kind of inspiring some of the things around the bucket stool, it also kind of inspires some of the ways I worked with plywood early on, where, had very crude tools, just a circular saw. I didn't even have a lot of clamps or anything like that. So even my first plywood projects were designed around a very limited skill set. I wasn't as confident making straight cuts as I am now. I didn't know all the tricks about clamping down straight edges and setting the offset from the blade guard to the blade. So I just stacked it, and I designed it in a way that I would allow the edges to not be perfectly aligned. And I said, oh yeah, it'll kind of look like some, kind of geological surface, or, kind of, it'll provide texture in an authentic way that's true to the means of manufacturing. So I think that was a big takeaway was, focus on what's authentic about what you're trying to achieve from an ideal standpoint and from also what you have access to. And don't sweat the aesthetic too much. Make your statement, know how you're trying to be useful and be of service to other people. And society's going to do aesthetically what it wants. I mean, I'm sure when Carhartt was originally conceived, they didn't eventually think that they were going to be streetwear for graphic designers. I think they were pretty focused to the workwear thing, and let that kind of reappropriation and dual usage emerge over time, but you don't really need to direct it too forcefully. Now, all the images that I'm showing you today come from 2 books, and I highly recommend both of these. So one is by Enzo himself, and it's, if I'm saying this right, Autoprogezione. And it's very simple, little spiral bound pictures, drawings, real clear. Almost like he's from Ted's woodworking with his plants. I bet you Ted actually stole his drawings and has them in one of those kind of crappy bundles that he's selling. The other one was a young designer named Eric A. Almquist, and it's just called Hammer and Nail. And he found Enzo's work and actually just recreated them all. And he has like photos and stuff like that. And he talks a little bit about what his work meant to him and like why he was sort of inspired to recreate them. And he has some nice little photos of the process along the way. He talks about he adapted them to the lumber that was different dimensions, I think in Switzerland or Sweden than it was in Italy. So recommend both of them, links in the description, and check them out. So even though Enzo Mari was the first designer that I was aware of that kind of had this open source approach, and I don't think open source was really a term back then, he wasn't the kind of last one that I would find or be inspired by that. And so if you think that this kind of work is intriguing and the kind of mission is noble or at least just interesting, I'd also check out the work of Samuel Mockbee. He did it more on the architecture side with the rural studio that he created in the southern parts of the US. And he had a similar sort of approach where he was trying to not necessarily as directly critique the way sort of mainstream, high-end, super educated architecture was going. He just looked at what it wasn't necessarily addressing, what kind of people it wasn't necessarily serving, and turned that into a creative opportunity. And I think for my own work is, I don't want my work to be a critique of anything. I want to make things. I don't want to critique things. I'm sure smart people could draw critiques from it and say, oh, if you think about the body of the work and all these things, then it sort of means this. That's for other people to say. And I'm happy to entertain that as a conversation, but it's not my primary intent. I think of this much more opportunistically, as I think that, well, if a lot of people are going this way, there might be some fun and interesting opportunities for me to kind of slightly veer off to the side. And this is why I'm never sort of comfortable with like thinking of my work as having a political affiliation. And whenever I look at somebody that sort of very explicitly says, these are my politics, this is what I do, all I end up sort of seeing are the inconsistencies. Not that that's bad, but they become evident. And so with me, I was more, well, I don't need to make a political statement about my work or make it about that. Other people will draw what they're going to draw. Even if I did have that as an intent, I probably wouldn't embody it perfectly. I might get like 20% of what I actually think into the work that then gets interpreted by other people. And also, I want to design stuff. I don't there's a reason why I didn't study political science and then run for office. Like, that's not my area of expertise. And even if I have, personal opinions as a citizen of the way things should be done, I tend to sort of focus on the things where I'm devoting my professional energy and try to be responsible for those things, and let other people that are devoting that energy to different fields focus on that. So even looking back now at my TEDx talk, which was quite some time ago, I'm like, yeah, I kind of did those things, but I've also strayed a little bit from a very narrow mission that I presented there. I feel very fortunate that I've gotten more opportunities out of this phase of my career than I certainly hoped for. And those probably, from the goals of what I had when I started, could be seen as distractions. But I also feel like the world's kind of changed around me. When I first started doing DIY projects on YouTube, there wasn't as many DIY projects on YouTube. Now I feel like very safe to say that like there will continue to be an incredible amount of awesome DIY content on YouTube, whether or not I publish another video myself on how to make another bench or table or anything like that. So while it can be kind of gratifying to think that your beliefs are embedded into your work, it's probably naive to think that they will be as complete or as accurately perceived as you hope them to be. But certainly no reason not to try. It's just not going to be the sole thing that I kind of hang my own determinations of success for a project on. But I do think Enzo Mari is like a really interesting type of person to be inspired by, right? Like, and when I think of sort of filmmakers that inspired me, not as a filmmaker, but as a YouTuber that's kind of DIYing it, I really like Christopher Nolan's work. I think a lot of his movies are, pretty brilliant, and like often with like mind-blowing visuals and smart storytelling devices. But I've never found them like personally inspiring the way, let's say, like Casey Neistat's work is. Casey isn't making any sort of atomic bombs to make his Oppenheimer movie, although I wouldn't put it past Mr. Beast to do that eventually. But I think what's so interesting about his work, and that really makes me inspired to pick up a camera and document things that I'm interested in, is how accessible he makes it. And again, I'm sure there's like, if Michael Bay was watching one of his movies, he'd be like, where's the slow-mo? Where's the hair and makeup crew where's the lens flare and all these kind of, fancy, kind of very cinematic and gimmicky things. But I think that's kind of the appeal. And I also think that that's also what's going to make his work much more timeless than a Transformers movie. Because the Transformers movie is it's just evidence of where technology was at that time. And when I look at like furniture design throughout the years, I see the same thing where I'll look at a lot of pieces and I'll be like, oh, that came from the 70s, because this is how they manufactured in the 70s. This is what was inexpensive. This is what was plentiful. These are the materials that are available in this part. So in some cases, when I think about the designer's kind of footprint, or their kind of fingerprint, or their signature on the physical piece that exists now, I'm seeing it much more through a filter of where technology and fabrication and industrialization was than necessarily what their kind of ideas were. Whereas I think Enzo Mari's ideas, if someone was to find this book and make them now, they're a lot truer to his original conception than a reproduction Ames chair is today to the Ames's sort of original conception of it. And that's really powerful. I mean, I think that's, I don't know if someone will watch like the bucket stool video 15, 20 years from now and then like make a 3-legged stool for themselves. I think it'd be awesome if they did. I'd be happy if they did it 2 years from now. But there is that kind of possibility. I know for sure that I won't be putting them into production 10 years from now and like mass producing them and selling them at Target. Not saying I would never do that with anything, but just not particularly intriguing, and certainly not for a project like that. But I do hope that a few of the ideas kind of kind of linger. And so when I think of my work today that I think most embodies what I learned from Enzo Mari, I'd probably say the table I did out of one sheet of plywood. So the 4-foot by 8-foot sheet of plywood in America has been around for a while. And I think in another 20 years, we'll still have 4-foot by 8-foot sheets of plywood. The glues might be a little bit more engineered. There might be some different resins that are even lower VOCs. The trees by that time might be genetically modified to grow super fast. Or maybe even some sort of fiber, like a hemp board or something like that, or bamboo or such. We may figure out a different sort of way to produce the wood fiber itself. But I think we'll still have sheet goods, and I think we'll still come in those sizes. So I don't try to think of any of my designs as timeless, but when I do think of things where the energy I spent to create and communicate the idea could have some significant value even years beyond the point of production, I am really proud of designs like that. So as long as we have 4-foot by 8 sheets of plywood, and you can make a table out of one of them. And maybe for now, that'll be with a circular saw and a drill to kind of drive in the screws. But, maybe in the future, CNCs become more practical or more available. Maybe there's one at every Home Depot, and you just load the plywood up into the CNC at Home Depot, and the design's preloaded, it cuts out all the pieces for you. So regardless, the kind of investment I made into kind of figuring out this particular set of geometries, I hope society gets some utility out of it for a long time. Whereas I'm not so sure with like some of the epoxy stuff. Like I feel like those might be good for now, but 3 years ago, they might be looking at epoxy projects the way they look at, shag carpeting in the 1990s, where you're like, oh, that was so like 60s and 70s. But so took some great lessons from Enzo Mari. Check out the books, and I will be doing some more series on these, probably with designers who are more directly aesthetically inspired my work. But I wanted to start off the series with one that more kind of inspired my career.